Before we get into Genesis, there's one other thing I think we need to spend a little time with. Again, because our culture has filled our heads with notions that are contrary to the Bible, and we are bombarded with these ideas all the time. I want to talk about the theory of evolution and creation. Now, some of you may have already studied that area of what's called apologetics. The term apologetics refers to giving a defense for a viewpoint, usually your Christian viewpoint. And from the Greek word apologia, which means defense. So it's not apologizing for being a Christian. Apologetics is where you're giving a defense for your views. And there's been a lot of good published material and lectures and debates you can get online about creation and evolution. I gave my first talk on this subject when I was in junior high school, so I was 13 years old, around 14 maybe. And after that, I gave it many other times throughout high school, and then when I was out of high school, I went to other high schools. Back then, it was easy to get invited to a biology class or science club at a high school and give talks about things like this. This is before the evolutionists got smart and realized that creationists had better arguments than the evolutionists had, and so they started banning, such conversations from public schools for the most part. I want to talk about evolution because it's a view that almost everyone has been taught, and Christians sometimes have given up their Christianity because of it, and others have accommodated their Christianity to it. And then, of course, the third view is that you stand for your Christianity against it. Now, the third option is the most difficult to do in modern times, socially, because if you suggest you don't believe in the theory of evolution, then everybody thinks you're primitive, like you're from the Stone Age, like you're not keeping track of what people are discovering and have been discovered for the past 150 years. And so you're looked at like you're an irrational fundamentalist type person, which isn't necessarily the case. You may be very well informed Christian and very scientifically trained. There's many people who are professional scientists with PhDs in their fields who believe that the Bible's true and that evolution isn't true. I say there are very many, but there's not as many as there are of the other sort. Because in the academic world, and especially the scientific community, for several generations now, all the students, and therefore those who became the teachers, have been indoctrinated with evolution for at least 100 years. And so the academic world just assumes evolution is true. When you watch a National Geographic special on some natural thing, or the History Channel, or whatever, you're going to see evolutionary origins assumed to be true. That's just part of living in the naturalistic culture we do, and even the postmodern culture doesn't really question it. Remember, postmodern culture doesn't care about what's true, but they kind of just assume that what they've been trained about this is true in most cases. So I want you to understand the nature of the case, because you're going to read, well, you have read just in the last day or two, Genesis. And you found Genesis 1, which is the main battleground of this issue, although the whole Bible is the battleground of this issue, because if God didn't create us, then the whole Bible is really just so much old superstitions and not even worth studying. What are you doing here? You're going to study this for 3 months? Why? Well, because hopefully it's true. I believe it's not hard to demonstrate the Bible's true. And I want to say this: I won't have time in the 2 weeks I'm here actually, to actually give you a full defense of the Bible in general, though I can, and I have. At my website, I mentioned, you can see lectures there. There's a series in the topical teachings at my website, thenarrowpath.com, called The Authority of Scripture, and quite a few lectures demonstrating evidentially that the Bible is true. And I won't be able to do that in these lectures. But I do want to talk about evolution because it deals directly with the question of Genesis chapter 1. First of all, the question of when was the beginning? It says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. When was that? Now, for many centuries, most Christians thought that was probably only a few thousand years ago. If you go through the genealogies in Genesis 5 and in Genesis 11, then you'll find that from Adam to Abraham, every generation is mentioned. 10 generations from Adam to Noah, and 10 from Noah to Abraham. Not only are the names given, but the ages of each person when they would have their son. So-and-so lived so long, and he begat this person as his son, and after he had begotten him, he lived this many years and died. His son, on the other hand, lived this many years and had this son. After that, he lived so many years, and then he died. Then his son had, after this many years, so you can actually total up the number of years from Adam to Abraham, and if you do so, you're going to get a figure that places Adam's creation around 2,000 years before Abraham. And Abraham lived about 2,000 years before Christ. So that would suggest that Adam lived around 4,000 years before Christ. And now the creation week in Genesis 1 suggests that Adam was created 6 days later than the world was created. So on this view, the world would only be, at this point in time, around 6,000 years old. Now, most creationists who believe in what we call the young Earth, because 6,000 years is a very young age for the Earth compared to what other people think is the age of the Earth. Those who believe in the young Earth theory don't always say it's exactly that long. There are some who say that it could be closer to 10,000 or 20,000, but they still say it's measured in thousands. Now, they would do that by suggesting that the genealogies somehow are not complete or something like that. I'm not going to get into the pros and cons of those arguments right now, but I'm just saying the young Earth creationists, Christians who hold this view, are placing the age of the Earth in the thousands of years, at the most maybe 20,000 years, at the very least 6,000 years, and that is very much out of harmony with the standard thinking on the matter in the past couple hundred years' time. The last couple hundred years, the idea that God didn't create things suddenly has arisen. Now, but I just want to make this clear. Augustine, back in the 4th century, did not necessarily believe in a literal young Earth creation. So, I mean, it's not just the modern scientists who have doubted. There have been Christians in ancient times who've interpreted Genesis somewhat other than in a younger Earth creation way. But most people in Christian lands, until a couple centuries ago anyway, believed the Earth was probably around 6,000 years old. Nowadays, it's much more standard to believe the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, not measured in thousands, but in billions. And that the universe is perhaps maybe 15 billion years old. And the universe began with the Big Bang, and everything began expanding from there, and stars and then solar systems around those stars began to form by natural processes, and eventually our Earth was one of them. And then things began to happen here. Life began to evolve here, maybe 3.5 billion years ago. They believe the Earth might have been cooling for a billion years, and then the first living thing came into being. And it came from non-life. Obviously, there was no life for it to come from. The first living thing, they assume, was a relatively simple organism, a cell, a single cell, like an amoeba. And that this came about from chemicals and elements that were in the world but were not themselves alive. We're talking about the first living thing. And if nature is all there is, then the first living thing had to come from non-living stuff. This phenomenon of a living thing springing out of non-living materials is called spontaneous generation. There was a time when a more superstitious Western world believed in spontaneous generation in other ways. They believed that, for example, that flies just emerged from rotting masses of manure, and that frogs just emerged from swamps from non-living things that because they hadn't traced the family background of these things yet scientifically, and there was a belief in spontaneous generation that living things would just kind of form from nothing, not from nothing, but from nothing living, from non-living things. It was Louis Pasteur who pretty much laid that idea to rest when he proved that germs don't just come from nowhere. They, a bit of water becomes contaminated when some germs from outside get in, whereas people thought germs just kind of emerged from nothing before that. Anyway, the idea that spontaneous generation occurs is pretty much an anti-scientific view now. However, evolutionism believes it happened once, and only once, because they believe that everything arose from that one time. Now you might say, well, why can't they believe that it happened, 4 or 5 or 100 times and living things came from those? Well, because they believe everything that's alive, plants and animals, are all interrelated. They say that because we all have DNA, we all have some things in common. And it's not likely that DNA, for example, something as complex as that, would come about spontaneously more than once. So everything that has DNA must have come from something that originally had DNA. Of course, it goes without saying that it's not very likely that DNA would arise more than once on its own. But we could go further, be more realistic, and say there's no possibility that DNA would arise even once on its own. DNA is information. It's not just chemicals thrown together. You can't just take the elements in a living thing and put them in a test tube and heat it to our temperature and stir it up and shoot electrical waves through it and have it come alive. It just doesn't happen. Living things, the DNA in every living thing is a very complicated set of instructions. It tells your every cell how to build proteins. Every cell is made out of proteins. Every cell is made of thousands of proteins, of hundreds of different kinds. A protein is a combination of amino acid units arranged in a certain distinct order to spell out a certain function. I don't know if you've ever seen these animations they have now. You can see them on YouTube if you want to. They didn't have them when I was young. It's really fascinating. They show these protein molecules going about in a cell on these pathways and stuff and doing their work, and they're like little robots in a factory. And there's hundreds of different species of proteins in a cell. They say that when Darwin believed that the first cell just emerged from who knows what, in his day they hadn't really seen what's in a cell. Their microscopes were not that good back then. All they thought a cell was just a little gelatinous blob with a little dark spot in it. Now they know that that dark spot is a nucleus that's full of all kinds of activity, which many molecular biologists say it's like an industrial city. It's like the cell is full of factories that produce stuff and that send out waste and the reproduction systems and digestive systems, all those things in a cell. It's a highly, highly complex thing. In fact, it used to be assumed, of course, that the first living cell probably came about relatively easily, maybe in some primordial puddle. The right kind of elements were there and lightning struck nearby and some of them fused together and became a living cell. And that would be 3.5 billion years ago. And then, the really hard part was to evolve from a single cell creature into human beings. But now most scientists say, no, the really hard part is getting the first cell. And that it might have taken 100 times longer for the first cell to form out of nothing than for the rest of evolution to take place. Because there is such a gap between the non-living world and the living world that it's bigger than the gap between an amoeba and a human being. And much bigger. And much less likely to take place, because evolution is based on the idea that living things reproduce, and when they reproduce, they pass on their genetic information to their offspring. The problem is sometimes the genetic copying goes wrong a little bit. You get what you call a mutation. So once in a while, the offspring isn't exactly like the parent. There's a bit of mutation there. Now, usually a mutation is not very good for an organism. Usually a mutation dooms it But once in a while, a mutation might confer a certain advantage to the organism. So in the struggle for existence, that mutant actually becomes the advantaged specimen that kills off all the others. And then it passes on that mutation to its offspring, of which 1 in a million of them might have a new mutation that makes it slightly even better. And so over millions and millions of generations, these little tiny mutations that'd be relatively imperceptible, you know, to the naked eye, they're accumulating over billions and billions of years till a creature very different is at the other end of that was there at the beginning. That's what evolution suggests. Now, of course, this process is what Darwin called natural selection. He said that nature selects. Now, let me just clarify this. The term natural selection is, I believe, a variant on another term called artificial selection. There's artificial selection and natural selection. Artificial selection is what takes place when breeders are breeding animals. And they want a certain kind of, they want a cow that puts out a certain kind of amount of milk or something. So they take the most productive cow they have and they breed her, and they take of her calves the ones that are most productive and breed them until you're just taking that productivity of milk as the only feature you're looking for, and you're breeding selectively, and you eventually get a breed of cows that consistently produce more milk than the original did. That's called selective breeding or artificial selection, because it's artificial because it's a man doing it, or a woman, and the man or the woman is actually selecting in each generation which cows have the traits they are hoping to perpetuate and to develop. They're selecting the better ones and eliminating from the breeding process the ones that aren't really going to pass on the traits you want. It's called artificial selection. They've been doing it from before the time of Darwin. But Darwin said nature does that. There's a natural selection that without a human or a god there to do the selecting, just nature itself will eliminate the inferior ones, and the ones that are more viable, which means more capable of living, in the competition for food and for survival in the environment, the more viable organisms are going to survive and reproduce more and pass on their superior traits to the next generation. And these will be accumulated over billions of years until everything evolves. Eventually you've got an amoeba that has become a human. Not simply, not easily. There's a long process of gazillions of generations over billions of years, but eventually the accumulation of these minor advantages that are brought about with certain mutations accumulate to become a major advantage. So that, let's say, a reptile can actually, over billions of years, evolve into a creature that has a wing, because a winged animal has advantages over a crawling animal, for example. So, but it would go through stages where the foreleg of the lizard would be maybe in one of its mutations in another generation would have something where the scales are becoming a little feathery instead of scaly, and where the shape of the bones are a little more conducive to becoming maybe several thousand mutations later a wing. So that you're going to have all these transitions between reptile and bird eventually, but the reptiles are going to eventually give rise to the birds. And so with every species of plant and animal. That's what evolution teaches. Now, so they believe that spontaneous generation had to occur, at least once, and only once really, that all plants and animals are interrelated. You know, that's different than the view of what we call special creation. God specially created this group, specially created that group, specially created that group. They're not related, they just live on the same planet side by side. Just like you people are probably not very closely related. If you go back to Adam and Eve, you are, but I mean, let's just say there might be two of you that look a lot alike, and someone say, oh, you could be sisters. And you'd say, no, we're not sisters, but people say that a lot about us. You know, why? Because you look alike, but you're not really related. One of the theories that people have, and I've had a lot of people say, do you have a brother, you know, in Chicago? I know a guy who looks a lot like you there. Someone asked me if my brother was Sam Elliott, the actor. That was actually a guard at the museum, art museum in Los Angeles. He said, is your brother Sam Elliott? But no, he's not. I don't even know the guy. But the truth is, when we see two specimens that look very similar. One theory is they have the same parents, perhaps. That would explain it. They're brother and sister. They share a lot of the traits of their parents. They're related. But then you find people who are very much lookalikes, doppelgangers, who are, in fact, not closely related at all. In other words, it's coincidental that they look similar. It's not explained through close relationship. Now, evolution, the theory of evolution looks at all the animal groups and shows how they have things similar to each other. They say, therefore, they must be related. Well, they could be, of course, but they might not be. They might have all been specially created, as they are. But that's the point. All creatures and plants are thought to be interrelated. That's why it is thought that the ape is our cousin, and that we're just a more highly evolved form of ape. And because everything's related. We're even related to plants if you go back far enough. The idea is that the first living thing branched off. The first single-celled creature not only gave rise to millions of offspring single-celled creatures, but eventually gave rise to multicellular creatures. Now, how difficult this is often passed over. Why would a single-celled creature give rise to a multi-celled creature? What is a multi-celled creature? A jellyfish, let's say? Or we're all multicellular. But the cells we have, we not only have millions and billions of cells in us, we have a lot of different kinds of cells. We got bone cells, muscle cells, brain cells, blood cells of different kinds, skin cells, hair cells. We got all kinds of different kinds of cells. They all have a different composition, a different set of proteins in them that make them different kinds of cells. But an amoeba is only one kind of cell. And it doesn't need lots of different kinds of cells because that one cell is capable of doing everything that a living thing has to do. It can reproduce without reproductive organs. It can take in food. It can give off its waste. It can move. You know, it doesn't need muscle cells and brain cells and reproductive cells and things like that. Amoebas, they're self-contained little living creatures. Why would they give rise to a creature that has a whole bunch of different kinds of cells? What would start that process? There'd be like two amoebas that separated but didn't get quite apart, and they're like Siamese twin amoebas. Now there's a two-celled creature, and then they tried it again, and then there's four. Well, then you just have a cluster of amoebas. You wouldn't have a multicellular creature. You'd have Siamese quadruplets of amoebas. You know, if you put a million amoebas stuck together, they don't make a jellyfish because a jellyfish has a lot of different kinds of cells. Amoebas are only one kind. How can a single-celled creature become a creature that requires all kinds of different cellular systems when an amoeba doesn't require them? There's no good answer to that, in my opinion. But that's a bridge that evolution has to cross if there's no intelligent design going on. Another thing that's very difficult to imagine, but it's still argued, is that invertebrates gave rise to vertebrates. Now, if you don't know those terms, an invertebrate is a creature that does not have an internal skeleton. Insects, for example, don't have internal skeletons. They have a shell on the outside. That's the only hard parts. All the inward parts, there's no bones in there. Jellyfish, corals, crustaceans, clams, crabs, lobsters. They're invertebrates. They have no skeleton inside. They only have a shell on the outside. If you've eaten lobster, you know you don't find any bones in there, right? Now, these are creatures that don't need skeletal systems to take shape and to hold their shape. Those are invertebrates. A vertebrate has a vertebrate, has vertebrae. It's a creature that has a skeleton inside it, not a shell on the outside. Fish have skeletons. Amphibians, frogs, salamanders, they have skeletons. Reptiles have skeletons. Birds, mammals have skeletons. They are vertebrates. But how did an invertebrate species become a vertebrate species? A skeleton isn't just a stiff piece of bone that just appeared somewhere. It's an arrangement of bones. It's bones connected in a certain way to be functional in a certain way. They're needed. Creatures that are vertebrates need a complete skeletal system, or they're not viable. They're not going to live. So it's like a creature that had no skeletal system has to somehow give rise to a creature that has a complete skeletal system, and there's got to be transitions in between those that move that direction. Why would a creature that began to develop part of a skeleton and didn't need one, why would that be more viable and pass on that to others so that the skeleton could further develop? There's not, in my opinion, a good answer to that either. Evolution needs to assume that happened, but to my mind, there's no good answer to that. Now, evolution teaches that the fish, who are vertebrates, the first vertebrates were fish-like creatures, they gave rise to the amphibia, which are the frogs and salamanders. And they gave rise to the reptiles. And the reptiles are snakes and lizards and turtles and crocodiles. And there's one type of reptile that's found only in New Zealand, and it's called the tuatara. It's kind of a dinosaur-looking creature. It's native to New Zealand and not much anywhere. There might be some of them in Australia, but I don't think it's mostly a New Zealand creature. But that's like there's like 5 branches of reptiles. Tuatara is a whole branch by itself. Then you've got lizards, snakes, turtles, and crocodilians. Those are all the reptiles. They came out from the amphibia. And then from the reptiles, came birds and mammals branching off the tree different directions in their evolution. Some developed wings and feathers. Others developed hair. Now, let me just note the difficulty here. What has to change? For a reptile to become a mammal, reptiles don't have hair. They're cold-blooded. They have no internal regulator of their body temperature. That's why reptiles like to go out and sun on the rocks, because the sun makes them warm. When they get cold, they get lethargic. They have to hibernate because their blood can freeze. Their reptiles' blood temperature is completely dependent, like fish's blood temperature, on the environment. They just take on the temperature of the environment. Birds and mammals, which allegedly came from reptiles, they're warm-blooded. They've got an internal thermostat. There's a certain ideal body temperature, and you can be out in the snow and you'll still be 98.6 if you're healthy, Fahrenheit. And you can be in a hot tub that's 100 degrees and your body will still be 98.6. Your body keeps its own temperature. That's what birds and mammals do. How did a reptile that didn't have any way of doing that evolve into a creature that did that? And why would that happen suddenly, or would that happen gradually? Everything's supposed to happen gradually in evolution. Why would that develop? And why would scales give way to hair or feathers? And more important, how would a creature that lays eggs, which reptiles do, give rise to creatures that don't lay eggs but develop their babies in a womb, reproduce, sexually, where this spermatozoa becomes a zygote with this egg, and it attaches within a uterus and develops and comes out a baby. Now, I want you to know, reptiles, they don't have that going on. They lay an egg. That egg is just a single cell, but it begins to split and become a baby reptile apart from the body of they don't host it. They don't have it developing in them. They don't have an umbilical cord feeding their infant. It's in an egg. And when a reptile hatches from an egg, it's identical to its parent, only smaller, and it's fully able to live by itself. It doesn't nurse, doesn't need milk from its mother. Mammals do. That's part of what makes them mammals. They have mammary glands. Mammals bear live young. They bring their young out alive. They're not mature. They're not independent young. They're babies that have to be cared for. They have to be nursed. They have hair. Not always at birth, but they grow hair. And so that's what mammals have, all these traits that reptiles don't have. How is this all going to come about? By gradual steps. How does a creature without a uterus gradually become a creature that has a uterus? And all its ancestors have been laying eggs, but suddenly one of them doesn't lay eggs anymore, just develops a baby inside that kind of just grows through a gestation process inside. This is what some people have called the just so stories of modern science. Do you know what the just so stories are? Rudyard Kipling wrote a group of children's stories that in a more literate age we learned when we were children. Rudyard Kipling's Just So stories, like How the Elephant Got Its Trunk. These are fairy tales, basically, that Kipling wrote. They said the elephant originally had a just regular nose, but a crocodile grabbed it by the nose, and there was a big tug of war, and finally the elephant got away, but it now had a long trunk, and that's how the elephant got its trunk. And there's those kinds of stories. There's several Just So stories about how certain animals got what they got, how the giraffe got its neck and so. But you know, some people who aren't so sold on this evolution theory say these are just so stories. There's no scientific explanation how these particular changes take place. Then you've got something else to deal with. An amoeba is not conscious. It has no brain. But it gave rise to creatures that are conscious. What is consciousness? A rock isn't conscious. Presumably a tree isn't conscious. If it is, it's not measurable. But animals are conscious. They're aware. They have a desire to live. Chemicals don't. And then human beings are not only conscious, but rational. We can reason and things like that, which apparently the lower animals don't do. So how did all of this develop? Now, the creationist view is they didn't. God made the fish, he made the amoebas, he made the reptiles, he made the amphibia, he made the birds, he made the mammals, and finally he made man in his own image, which is why man has rational capabilities, can think, can create. Animals don't create. Some people say, well, spiders seem very creative to me. They make these elaborate webs, and birds make amazing nests. Beavers build dams. Why would you say they don't create? Because they don't create. For the past thousands of years, beavers have always made the same dams that their parents made. They haven't developed anything. Spiders certainly haven't sat down with an architectural, plan to build a web. They'd have to have engineering experience as well. Besides, they'd have to be able to produce from their own rear end the materials. I mean, how does that evolve? How do they know to do that? That's genius, but it's not their genius. It's God's genius putting them in the form of instinct. Humans have human genius that God put in us. We have the ability to create computers and cars and airplanes and spaceships, things like that. We create almost anything because that's the image of God. So according to Genesis, God made everything as he made it, and that explains everything. Now some people say, well, just because it explains everything, that doesn't mean it's a good idea, because after all, explaining things is what we want things to do. Maybe we're taking a shortcut to find an easy explanation. Science can't live with the easy explanations. Science has to figure things out. Maybe the explanation is really hard. And it's very childish to seek a real easy explanation. Well, God did it. They call this the God of the gaps idea. Have you heard of that expression, God of the gaps? What it means is this. It is assumed by many that primitive people didn't know what made a volcano go off, what made an earthquake happen, what caused a tsunami, what caused hurricanes. And therefore, primitive people just thought, oh, it's the God of the hurricanes, the God of the volcanoes, the God of, the ocean. These gods are making this happen. But as science developed, we can actually explain the movement of tectonic plates, and we can predict tsunamis in advance and hurricanes. We've explained these things scientifically. We don't need a god of the volcano. We don't need a god of the hurricane. We can explain by natural means how these things happen. So they say what people didn't know about science, like why does a volcano go? From what they're saying, there was a big gap in their knowledge. So they put God in the gap. God did it. But as science explains these things more and more, the gaps close. And they squeeze out God. If we can give a scientific explanation, they say, we don't need the God theory. We just have scientific discovery. Now, this is kind of the way that atheists today and secularists today in general think about us. They think that we have a God of the gaps. There's still some things we can't understand yet, so we invoke this mythical God. He did it. But you know, that would suggest that our view that there is a God is based on our ignorance about certain phenomena we can't explain. So we just say God did it. But that's not really where we're coming from. We come from a very different place. It's an argument from what we know, not what we don't know. One thing we know is that complex information systems don't arise without a mind. They just don't. We have some experience with complex information systems, computers and that kind of stuff. I mean, even books have data in them, have information in them. We know information. What we don't know is that information could ever come about without a mind. Could you expect an explosion in a print shop to produce Webster's dictionary that had all the correct information in it? I mean, Webster's dictionary isn't just an arrangement of black ink on paper that happens to be the right size and shape and bound perfectly and so forth. That wouldn't happen by accident either. But even if it did, you'd have to look inside and say, wait, that's the right definition for this word. All the information's correct. Where'd that information come from? That comes from a mind. Only a mind can produce a dictionary or a book that makes any kind of sense. And even if you could explain natural processes that brought about the volcano to go off or whatever, that doesn't mean God didn't do it. Just to say we now know how God did it, or we know the processes God used to make it happen, that doesn't mean there's no God. That's still another question. Once you could explain everything in the natural world scientifically, you have not even begun to touch the question of whether there's a God or not. Because all that science is able to do is study the natural world. God's not in the natural world. God's supernatural. How would you discover God? By scientific means. You know, when the Russians sent their first cosmonaut up into space, I'm told that a school teacher told her class of third graders, our brave cosmonauts have gone out into outer space and they didn't see God anywhere. And one of the little girls said, were they pure in heart? I don't know if that story's true or if it's apocryphal, but the truth is, it illustrates well. The teacher thought if there's a God, our modern science that sends him into space would be able to tell us. But what if God is not seen that way? What if God is not seen the same way as other things? What if he's spirit? What if you have to have the right heart to see him or to know him? Jesus said, blessed are the pure in heart, they shall see God. He didn't say, blessed are the scientifically advanced who have a good telescope and who have the right litmus paper and a Geiger counter. You can't discover God's presence with a Geiger counter. You can't discover God's presence with any scientific method. If he exists totally separate from that. And it's not against science. It's just beyond science. Science can study what they can study, which is the material world. They can't study what's not in the material world. So science can learn to explain everything in the natural world someday. They're far from it right now, but if they can, they still wouldn't have proven that there's no God. C.S. Lewis was having an argument with a friend of his, an atheist, who said, well, science has pretty much proved there are no miracles. And Lewis said, really? Which of the sciences precisely has proven that? And he said, well, that's just a matter of detail. But, all those intellectuals know that we don't need to believe in God anymore because we have nature, natural understanding of things. And C.S. Lewis said, well, suppose I put 4 pennies in my drawer today, and I come back the next day and put 2 more pennies in there. How many pennies will be there then? And his friend took a while to do the calculation, and they said, well, there'll be 6 pennies, unless there's been a thief at the drawer. And Lewis said, that's exactly right. The laws of mathematics will tell you how many are there if there's been no thief at the drawer. The question of whether there's been a thief at the drawer or not in the meantime, the laws of mathematics have nothing to say about. They can tell you how things will be if there's no interference. They can't tell you how things will be if there is, or whether there will be interference. The laws of mathematics can't tell you whether someone's going to come and steal those 4 pennies before you put 2 more in there. It could happen, But science and math can't tell you whether it's going to happen. That's in a different realm altogether. And likewise, science can tell you how things operate in the world. They can't say that miracles don't occur because they can't tell us whether there's a God or not who could interfere once in a while and make things happen differently. They just assume naturalism, and so everything has to be explained naturally. Now, I want to tell you what some of the evidence is thought to be for evolution. Everybody knows that variation occurs within species. That's the starting point of Darwin's theory. Variation occurs within species. If you have a cat who gets pregnant, you're going to find maybe some of those kittens are black and white. Maybe some of them have a bit of orange in them. Maybe some of them are pure white or pure black. All from one litter. They look different than their mother, and maybe different than their father. Some of them look like their mother, some look like their father, some look like something else, but they're different. There's variation in coloration. There's also probably variation in size and health. There might be a runt in the litter that's not going to live very well unless you give it special care. There might be an aggressive, stronger kitten that takes the food from the others. This is in your home. Out in the natural world, this is the way things are too. And so the stronger ones feed on the weaker ones, and the weaker ones just die. We don't have someone to care for them. But this would mean that over time, you get a better, stronger strain of lions and tigers and bears than you would have at an earlier time, because the weaker ones don't live to reproduce and pass on their weakness. And so there is what they call, we sometimes call it microevolution. There's never been anyone who denies this, that things change. Microevolution is done in the laboratory a lot of times, like with fruit flies. The fruit fly was selected for this kind of experiments many decades ago because it has a really short reproductive cycle, and therefore you can produce lots of generations in a short time. And so they could expose it to all kinds of mutational influences, gamma rays, X-rays, things like that, that might cause them to mutate. And they've gotten all kinds of fruit flies over the past 100 years or so. They've got fruit flies that have big eyes, normal eyes, and some with no eyes. They've got some that have big wings, and some that have little wings, and some that have no wings. They've got some that have a lot of hairs on their thorax. They've got some that don't have any hairs on their thorax. They've got all these changes, these variations in the same species. But that's just it. It's still variations in the same species. It hasn't become another species. What animal breeders and experimenters have found when it comes to micro mutations like this, or microevolution, is that there seem to be boundaries within a species. Dogs, for example, can look very different from other dogs. They're all one species, Canis familiaris. But a Chihuahua, a little Mexican hairless critter, and a Saint Bernard, it's hard to believe they're the same species. I mean, two frogs of very different species look more like each other than two dogs that are the same species in many cases, if it's a different breed. But they've got about 200 breeds of dogs now, or more. But they found a boundary. They've kind of run out of varieties and changes they can make, because the dog has a genetic pool that allows for variation, but not infinite variation. If you're going to make a dog become something that's not a dog, it doesn't have dog traits, let's say become an eagle, you're going to have some new genetic information added from somewhere. Mutation isn't enough. Mutation is just damaging the genetic information in the creature so that something comes out different and usually inferior. It's not very common for a mutation to create something that's going to be more suited for survival than its parents were. Almost all genetic changes and mutation kill the creature or make it less able to live. So the fact that there is micro mutation, microevolution, and change like the variations in breeding of dogs, does not extrapolate to macroevolution, where dogs can evolve into something that's not at all dog-like. Maybe eventually, if you give them long enough, into ape-like creatures or something like that. It just doesn't happen. There's a boundary, there's a species boundary. It's not, well, it may not be a species boundary, but a type boundary. And so it looks like, although God has made things so that things can change, they can't change infinitely. And that's where evolution would say otherwise. Evolution says, well, if it can change this much, there's no telling how much it might change given billions of years. Well, we don't have billions of years to check that out. What we have found is the experiments have shown you do reach a boundary. You can find a lot of variation through mutation and selective breeding, but you reach a boundary eventually. And you just keep getting the same things over again then. There's a theory that was called embryological recapitulation. If you guys are as hot as I am, might want to open windows or a door here, because I don't want you guys to fall asleep. This is good material to fall asleep to.
Can you say that word again?
Embryological, from the word embryo.
Yeah.
Embryological recapitulation. Have you heard about, a recap?
Yeah.
That's short for recapitulation. Okay, it's going over it again.
Got it.
Okay, so embryological recapitulation, the idea was this, that human beings, for example, when we are embryos in our mother's womb, before we're born, we go through the whole evolutionary system, again, rapidly in 9 months, that we went through over billions of years. So we start out as one cell, then it's 2, then 4, then it becomes like kind of fish-like, with gill slits and so forth. Then it goes through stages of greater and greater complexity until it's human. And it was once thought, I say it was once thought because it's not really a theory that scientists believe anymore, but many times people on the street still use it. It was once thought that this proves evolution, because after all, we do go through all the stages of evolution in 9 months, which recapitulates our whole evolutionary ancestry, and all animals do this, they say. Well, this is not true, and it's not really thought to be true anymore. About 100 years ago, real scientists gave up this argument. In fact, 40-something years ago, I was giving a talk at the Worcester State College in Massachusetts. A Christian student had somehow persuaded the professor of biology to invite me to speak on this subject, though it was a secular and evolutionary teacher. And I gave a talk like this, and I opened it up for questions from the classroom, and one of the guys says, what about this embryos going through the evolutionary process again? And I gave him some examples how this isn't true. For example, in the human embryo, we'll take ourselves, the human heart, when it develops, it starts with 2 chambers, then it goes to 1, then to 4. That's not really a progress in complexity. The human fetus has a tongue before it has teeth, but almost all evolutionists believe that creatures with teeth existed before the creatures with tongues did. And so, I mean, there's this kind of stuff. There's lots of things like that. Well, most of all, I mean, scientists point out that there's never a point in the human embryo's development that looks like an ape. As soon as it starts looking like anything, it looks like a little human. They used to talk about the gill slits of the fishes on a human embryo. There's these little bars and grooves that appear on the embryo's neck at a certain point early in the development. They say, oh, that's like the gills of a fish. Well, what they found out as they studied the embryo more, and that's why they gave up this whole embryological recapitulation idea, is because they did study the embryos more and realized it's just not true. These so-called gill slits, they don't become gills, they don't develop into the breathing apparatus at all. They never really open at the throat, so they're not slits. And so since they're not gills and they're not slits, they're certainly not gill slits. But that was thrown out the window. Now, I was given some of those answers to these students, and the students were just not buying it. They're just arguing back and forth. And finally, the teacher, who did not like me at all, he addressed the student and said, listen, the embryological argument was given up over 50 years ago. I knew that. In fact, I told him that. Stephen Jay Gould, around the same time, had said that he says for the past 50 years, this argument's been defunct. And now that's been 40-something years ago now. It's been almost 100 years that they don't use it. But you'll still meet people, students in college and stuff, who still give that argument. because they're desperate for arguments. Evolution does not have any proofs available, so they have to use what they can use. That one doesn't work very well. I mean, how would that be real evolution? Yes, we do start out as a single cell, but it's not an amoeba, it's a human single cell. It's got human DNA. And it's that human DNA that dictates it growing into a human. An amoeba doesn't have human DNA. Any creature that has human DNA becomes a human. That's why when people say, well, it's not really a baby in there, it's just a tissue block. Well, it's not living. Well, why is it growing if it's not living? Well, but it's not a person. Well, it's got human DNA. What species is it? Of course it's a person. And it's growing. It's a living person. It's got a human DNA. That makes it human. It's growing. That means it's alive. How can it be anything but a living human? But it can't live by itself outside the womb. Neither can a newborn baby without help. You leave a newborn baby without support, or you send a man into space and take off his space helmet in an environment he can't live in, he's going to die. That means he's not human. It means he's in an environment he's not ready to live in. You know, that doesn't make him non-human. A person doesn't become human when they come out to a new environment, and they were inhuman before that. Anyway, the point here is the embryo is human from the beginning, as human DNA. And true of all other species as well, right from the beginning. Sure, they're a single cell to start with, but they're a specific cell of that species from the very beginning. Then there's the vestigial structures and organs. I want to get over these quickly if I can. Back in the 1800s, scientists listed 180 structures in the human body that they said we have no use for them. We got a tailbone, but we don't have a tail. We don't need a tail. Our ancestors needed tails. And as evolution took place, eventually the tail dropped off, but the tailbone remains as a vestigial testimony that we once had tails. They say if you have structures in your body and organs in your body that don't do anything, well then they must have done something for one of your ancestors in another species that used to have that, needed it. In the course of evolution, you became something else, but you didn't lose that. And therefore they call these vestigial organs or vestigial structures. Like I said, H.G. Wells boasted that there were 180 structures in the human body that are useless. He said every one of them is a testimony against special creation. Because they say, why would God create a being that has all kinds of things they don't use? Evolution might retain them, even after you don't need them anymore, but God designing things wouldn't put those in there. Well, this used to be a strong argument until, of course, science advanced. What happens when science advances? They learn things they didn't know before. And they used to think that the thymus gland and the appendix and the tonsils and a whole bunch of other things were on that list of things that don't have any function. And even the tailbone. But now they've found important uses of those things. And they just didn't know them back in the 1800s. With the progress of science, that list of 180 useless structures in the human has dwindled down to about 3 or 4. That they still don't know the use for them. But the trend in discovery gives one optimism in assuming they will someday know what those are for too. The tailbone, by the way, is useful. It's an anchor for certain pelvic muscles that need someplace to attach. And there are people, because of cancer and so forth, that have had their tailbone removed. They can't sit comfortably anymore. It's easier to sit on a tripod than on a two-legged stool, you know? A three-legged stool is better than two-legged for sitting stably. And so, anyway, these vestigial structures were thought to be a proof of evolution because God wouldn't make useless junk and put it in the design. No, he didn't. The fact that we don't know what everything is used for yet does not mean it's useless, as the trend in scientific discovery in the past 200 years has proven. Now there's another thing, and I touched on this earlier, and that's the word homology. 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 And that's not the study of gays, by the way. That is the study of shared structures in different species. Different species have things in them that are similar to other species. Take the fin of a whale, the wing of a bat, and the hand of a man. Very different structures for different things. A whale lives in one environment, a bat flies, a man uses his hands for other things. But the whale's fin, the bat's wing, and the human head have the same basic pentadigital structure. They have 5, fingers, as it were. In a whale's fin, there's 5, like, fingers in it. The bat's wing is also made from 5 extended fingers, a membrane stretched between them. And they say, well, why would that be? Unless they evolved from a common ancestor. Homology teaches that the similarities that exist in different creatures derive from a common ancestor that had that structure. In other words, they believe that a whale, a bat, and a man all evolved, if you go back far, 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 far back in the family tree before there were any mammals. There was some creature there that gave rise to all the mammals, and it had this pentadigital structure, okay? Now, as evolution took place, some of the creatures evolved into flying creatures, some into aquatic creatures, some into land creatures, and this basic structure continued to be modified through them all, so that tells that we all have that because we have that similar ancestry. So again, it's the idea of, like, if you look like someone else and someone says, are you 2 sisters? You say, no, we just kind of look a lot alike. Well, they're assuming that you have same ancestors, that your parents or grandparents, they must be the same because you have similarities that not everyone has in your looks. But it's only an assumption. Just because 2 people look a lot alike doesn't mean that they're close relatives. Just because different creatures have similar structures doesn't mean they're related to each other and that they came from common ancestry. They might have, that's one theory, but it's not the only possible theory. Certainly all cars, for the most part, with very few exceptions, have 4 wheels. Now, not all cars have come from the same manufacturer or even have come from each other. It's just sound engineering to put a car on 4 wheels. It's good for stability. And those who design cars have generally not found a better way to do things than to give them 4 wheels, because it's a sound engineering principle. Bridges are different from each other, but they all have certain things in common with each other, because there's certain engineering features that go into every bridge, or else it's not going to hold any weight. You see, creationists believe that God used sound engineering principles in creating species. If several different species had to breathe the same air, why not give them similar lungs for breathing that air? I mean, he could make a million different kinds of mechanisms and not give them all lungs, but if lungs work good for one, why not use the same for all the other creatures who could breathe the same air? If gills work for creatures that have to breathe underwater, why not give gills to the vast majority of creatures that live underwater? I mean, it's just sound design. Now, a person can say, well, I don't believe that, I think that's just making an excuse. Well, you've got data, and then you've got the interpretation of data. This is what people have to understand. They say science has proven evolution. It does not. You can take all the data, all the evidence they use, and say, okay, you can explain this data, interpret it in line with this theological model, not theological, this scientific model, so-called scientific model of evolution. You can take the same data and fit into a theological model. It says God did that, God did that, God did that. Now, some people might say, well, you're just doing the God of the gaps thing. Well, to tell you the truth, I'm not. When I find information, I know there's a mind. When I find something well engineered, I have to assume there's an engineer. Chance alone would not necessarily produce creatures that are symmetrical, with 2 arms that are the same length, 2 legs that are the same length, 2 eyes that are positioned symmetrically on the face. I mean, a creature with an eye here and an eye there might survive as easily as one with eyes there. I mean, chance itself would pay no attention to aesthetics. There's artistry here. There's design here. There's engineering here. And there's information in the genetic code that dictates that this is how these creatures will develop into these shapes and sizes. Now, if you are on an island, I just want to say this. Richard Dawkins, how many of you know who Richard Dawkins is? It's like the most famous atheist right now, author. He's a great biologist in England, but he's not a great philosopher. And he doesn't know much about God. But he says theism, or belief in God, is more irrational than atheism, because he says theists say, well, look at all this complexity. It must have been made by a mind. It must have been made by God. But he says any God who can make it would have to be more complex than the things he made, just like an inventor is more complex. His brain is more complex than the machines he makes. Therefore, you'd have to explain who made God. In other words, if complexity requires that you have a creator, well, then that creator's going to be more complex. You have to have someone to create him. So you've got this endless regress back to who created God, who created the one who created God, who created that. And he says, therefore, there can be no God. Well, to my mind, that's nonsense. If you're on a desert island and you're Robinson Crusoe, and you're there for months and you never see another human being, and you conclude there's no human beings here. And then one day you go to the beach and there's a footprint of a foot a different size than your own, a human footprint. And you say, I believe there's a human being here on the island with me. He left a footprint. Now, a skeptic might say, that's a ridiculous argument, because a footprint is not as complex as a human being. If you can explain the existence of the footprint by a man who made it, then how are you going to explain the existence of the man, who's more complex? I mean, that's a ridiculous argument. I don't need to explain the existence of the man. I know where footprints come from. Footprints come from people. There's a people here somewhere. Let someone else worry about where the person came from. I have evidence for a person here. If you find on the beach that someone has scrawled in the wet sand in large letters for airplanes to see, help. You say, and you didn't do it. You say, hey, somebody else is here. How do I know it? Let's just say you have another companion who says, I didn't do it either, but why do we know someone's there who did that? Maybe the seagulls scratched it like that. Maybe some stick that was being dragged back to sea just scratched the sand and made these marks. Marks, maybe. Information, never. The letters H-E-L-P aren't just random marks. They contain a message from a mind. It's information. So you might say, but we haven't seen any human beings here. I don't care. Someone is here. And people go, we can't see or prove there's a God. Well, there's information in the amoeba. There's information in my cells and in your cells. That's why we grow and develop into these well-engineered, well-designed machines that have the capacity to think and to reason, to create. That's because of information that is in our genetic code. That's because there's someone who is communicating that information, putting it there. Now, so homology, just because things are very similar, doesn't mean that they're related to each other, and just because, well, I kind of got off on the subject of design a little bit, but God could design many things that are similar to each other. Most famous artists, my wife retired a couple of years ago. She was an art professor for 40 years at the community college. And she can see certain paintings in a book of paintings and say, oh, that's obviously somebody. You can tell I don't know my artist enough even to name one. But if I think long enough, I can think of some artists, but I wouldn't know who's what stuff. She would, because he's got a certain style. He's unique, or she, you know? You can tell the artist or the creator's style by the similarities in all the works they produce. If there weren't the similarities that exist in all the species, at least DNA is a similarity they all have, even plants have that. That doesn't prove we evolved from them, but it does mean that the same designer must have designed all of these. If every creature had something that was entirely different from each other, and nothing in common with others, we might wonder how many designers are out there. Each one might be designed by a different god. But it's the similarities that are sort of the trademark, sort of the signature of the creator. And now there's one other argument for evolution that's very important, and that it has to do with the fossils and the geological record. The fossils are, of course, bones of animals and plants, not bones of plants, but parts of, let's just say, parts of animals and plants that have been fossilized and become stone. You can see their imprint in the stone. The assumption of evolution is that these stones were laid down over billions of years as sedimentary rock carried in with rivers and bodies of water, even oceans, have formed by the sediments settling down on the riverbed or whatever, and covering up the skeletons or the bodies of certain creatures and plants. And then they solidify into rock, and then paleontologists, or the people who dig them up and find them, say, oh, here's where they were. Now, because it is thought that this process takes millions of years, it is thought that as you move up the geological column from the lower to the higher, you're going to the more recent rocks, and the lower rocks are going to be very old. That's not always the case, but that's the assumption in most cases. And therefore you find, for example, in lower rocks, fossils of very simple creatures. As you go up, you'll find somewhat more complex creatures, fishes and things like that. And as you go higher and higher, you find an ascending hierarchy of complexity. Now the assumption is that these rocks were laid down over millions of years, therefore the fossils you find in them are a sample of the kinds of creatures that lived at that time and died at that time. And then later on there are other kinds of creatures and later other ones. And so they say this proves evolution. Well, there's a couple of responses to that, very important to note. First of all, and this is not necessary to assume, but even if it did take millions of years for those rocks to form, and even if those are ecological zones where different kinds of creatures lived at different times, and even if they did become more complex over time, that still doesn't tell us if they evolved or not. What if God, I mean, if we're not stuck with the Bible, if we just believe there's a God who did things, and we're not necessarily going by Genesis specifically, we can say there's a God who made the simple creatures first, a few million years later came back and made these, and then made, and he just got, he's being creative, he's developing his talent. You know, that they, unless we can show that any of the creatures evolved from others, the mere data in the rocks doesn't prove that they weren't created. But more than that, there are phenomena that lead many scientists to believe these rocks were not laid down over millions of years. For example, they find what they call polystrate fossils, which are fossils of creatures or plants that actually transcend several layers, several strata of fossils, like a tree. That goes through several strata that supposedly took millions of years to lay down. Well, was that tree there for millions of years? And sometimes they're upside down, with the roots up and the branches down. So is that tree growing for millions of years upside down? Not likely. There are other large animals and plants that sometimes they fit through various layers. They take up more than one. They're called polystrate fossils. There's also, of course, the phenomenon of sometimes the animals are not in the proper order. You find creatures that are actually more modern, supposedly, in lower strata than more ancient ones, ancient animals. And that's sort of the wrong order. This is also known in paleontology. Now, they say that the second phenomenon, they say, is possibly that through an earthquake or something like that, a big slab of rock turned upside down, and that put the older ones on top. And could be. That kind of thing has been known to happen. But as far as the polystrate fossils, I don't really know what can answer those things. But there are Christians, not all Christians believe this, but there are Christians who believe that these strata were laid down at the time of the flood. And that all those rocks were not laid down over millions of years, but over 1 year, while the earth was covered with water and there were earthquakes and the fountains of the great deep were broken up and everything was turbulent, when mountain ranges may have been formed, where valleys and gorges may have been formed, and where creatures were trapped at all different levels in the mud. Now, one thing is clear, fossils, most creatures that die do not leave a fossil at all. The reason is because scavengers eat them. If you if you die out in the desert, no one's going to find your skeleton intact a million years from now. The coyotes and the buzzards and so forth, they're going to pick it apart. They're going to take the bones off to their lair. They're going to, it's not going to be intact. The only way that a creature or a plant becomes fossilized is if it is suddenly covered with wet mud, so that the environment cannot get to it. It's sealed off from the elements that would cause it to deteriorate. It's sealed off from animals that would eat it and tear it apart. And not one animal in a million that dies probably becomes a fossil, because it's so hard to make a fossil. But the fossils that exist, they testify to rapid movement of water and mud covering up creatures at the moment of their death, or not very much later than the moment of their death. Now, the creatures that are not very mobile are simply, they have very simple body structures, and they're going to be found buried at the lower levels. Fish and such that can swim, they can go to higher levels before the mud catches them and covers them. Creatures that can go on land are going to get higher. Man's going to get highest of all out of there, because he can build rafts and things like that. But you would find a general tendency for the simpler creatures to be captured near the bottom, and the more complex creatures, which are more mobile, before they get caught in the mud and killed and fossilized, to be near the top. This is an oversimplification, but I'm not here to give a scientific lecture. I have longer lectures on these things at my website. But the point here is, there are many scientists, they are not the majority, they're a small minority in fact, but they are creation scientists who believe that the fossil record is the result of mud and the formation of rock and at the time of the flood, which captured living animals. It's interesting that so many, you find these dinosaur graveyards where it's like at the bottom of what was maybe a rushing river valley or something like that, and all these dinosaur skulls are like slammed up against a rock, and and most of them have their necks broken, like they're, if you look at pictures of dinosaur fossils that are found in rocks, more often than not their neck is snapped and their head's back like that. They didn't just lay down and die and become a fossil. Something catastrophic happened. And you do find, of course, shellfish and other marine fossils at the tops of mountains now and things like that. That doesn't prove the flood, but it's consistent with it. And so again, what I'm saying is the same evidence that can be pressed into an evolutionary model and say, we can interpret this evidence to support evolution. If you have a different model, a biblical model, it fits that too. It's just that the Bible is out of style. And belief in miracles, belief in a flood, belief in creation are simply considered to be old-fashioned today by the modern and postmodern world. And therefore, to say, well, hey, the evidence fits what I believe in the Bible. Well, you'll just look like you're special pleading, like you're somebody who's just trying to hang on to an old superstition that you learned from childhood or something like that. But the truth is, the data can be interpreted in view of this as well. Now, one thing that really is harmful about the fossil record to the evolutionary idea is that the fossil record, no doubt, is a true sampling of creatures that have lived throughout time. And if evolution is true, then there would have been millions of creatures that were what we call transitional forms. For fish to evolve into salamanders, for example, or frogs, would require there to be thousands or millions of generations of creatures that were becoming salamanders, but they weren't yet salamanders. They're still more fish-like than salamander-like. Eventually, there would be a creature that's like half and half. And as you go further on, there'd be some that are almost entirely amphibians, but they still have some fishy characteristics. So there'd be these various gradations, because according to evolution, this happens extremely gradually, just a little change at a time. So over the millions of years, you'd have creatures of all kinds of transitions between one type and another. If reptiles evolved into birds, you'd have, in the fossil record, creatures that were part bird and part reptile. Now, they have found fossil dinosaurs, which they say have some feather beginning on them. Now, I'm not an expert about that. Maybe there are some, maybe there were some feathered dinosaurs that God made. But the truth is, there's There's no gradual transition from one group to another at all. And this is something that bothered Darwin. This is something that bothers honest evolutionists today. They admit it. I don't have to go over the quotes I give in my lectures online, but the truth is what Stephen Jay Gould, who was a Harvard paleontologist and one of the favorites of the American Academy until his death, he was an atheist. He said that the absence of these transitional forms in the fossil record is the trade secret of paleontology. In other words, they don't like to tell people about it because it does not support evolution. If evolution really happened, you'd have thousands of micro-transitional differences in species that show up in the fossil record. Now, Darwin knew this. In his book, The Origin of Species, he actually said, geology, he meant paleontology, has done almost nothing to fill in these gaps. But he said, we can hope that as discovery increases, they will find these transitional forms, because they certainly must have existed if evolution happened. We just haven't found them yet. So it might be like me saying, well, these vestigial structures, still 2 or 3, we don't know where they are, but they'll find them. But the difference is that 175 of them have been found, of the uses of them, and there's a handful left. They haven't found any real evidence of transitional forms in the fossil record, and it's been approaching 175 years or whatever since Darwin. And yet they have found millions of fossils. They have not found any fossils of genuine transitions. Now they do have some animals they found that are a little bit like a land animal, a little bit like a sea animal. And they think, well, maybe that's a transition from a land animal to a whale or a dolphin or something like that. They have found Archaeopteryx, which is a bird-like, or a reptile-like bird, found in Germany. They found, I don't know how many they found now. They originally found about 4 skeletons of them, and they have some reptilian traits, but they're birds with fully developed feathers and wings and so forth. But scientists have to admit, that's not a transition between reptiles and birds, that's a bird. That's a bird that has some characteristics most birds don't have. There are some pretty strange creatures in this part of the world, where we are right now, like the Duckbill Platypus, which has the body, it's clearly a mammal. It's part of a very small order of mammals called monotremes. It lays eggs. Mammals don't lay eggs by definition. By definition, mammals give birth to live young. There's 2 exceptions, the Duckbill Platypus and the echidna, I think it's pronounced, echidna. It's a spiny anteater. Those are the only exceptions. They lay eggs like reptiles and birds do, but they have hair like only mammals do. They have mammary glands. They do nurse their young like only mammals do. The Duckbill Platypus in particular has a strange little configuration on its face, looks more like a duck than any kind of mammal. It's got a spur that's like a rattletooth fang on its back leg. It's got all these strange things that most mammals don't have. Now, nobody I've ever heard of has ever pointed to the Duckbill Platypus as a transitional form. Even though it lays eggs like reptiles do, and it has other characteristics that are mammalian, no one thinks it's a transitional form because it's not transitional between any 2 things. There's not some creature that's pre-platypus that it came from. And it's just what we'd have to call an unusual mammal. I think Archaeopteryx, which is a bird that has some reptilian kind of characteristics, teeth, for example, which birds don't usually have, that it's an unusual bird. So what scientists need is not a handful of transitional forms here and there. They need thousands of them between every major species group, because every variation is said to have happened slowly over time, and they don't have that. And that's a very problematic thing for evolutionists. They try to minimize it in many cases, especially the really die-hard ones, but there's many atheist, evolutionists, paleontologists who come right out and say exactly what I just said. It's a problem. We need transitional forms. The fossil record doesn't provide any. Now, of course, Darwin said, well, we just haven't found the fossils yet. And he was right in his day. They hadn't found very many paleontology was an infant science. They hadn't even discovered dinosaurs yet, I think, when Darwin wrote his book. Dinosaur bones. Isn't that funny? We take them so much for granted. Like 200 years ago, they didn't even know they existed. But they have found the fossils now. If you go to the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, there's over 1 million fossils in that one building. There's millions and millions, thousands of millions of fossils. I have a friend who goes out fossil hunting on the weekend, brings home a bucket full of little trilobites and things like that, fossils he finds in certain places. Fossils are not hard to find. They're all over the place. They're just laying on the ground. When you're walking in the desert, you'll see stones with fossils in them. And so, I mean, Darwin's day, they hadn't found that many. They found far too many to make that excuse anymore. Because even if you only had 100 fossils and no more, there should be a true sampling of the creatures that have lived and died over time. And what you find is creatures that are fish. You find some that are, invertebrates. You find some that are reptiles. You find some that are birds. You find some that are mammals. Among the mammals, some are canines, some are felines, some are, anthropoid apes. Some of them are lemurs. They're all different kinds of creatures. You don't find any transitional forms between any of these groups. And if those creatures lived, they should have died. And if they died, they should have left some fossils once in a while. And if they didn't, I realize it's very hard for something that dies to become a fossil. Most things that die don't. But we got a lot of creatures that did leave fossils. Why is it that there's a pattern? And all the creatures that left fossils give a testimony to special creation, not evolution. This is one of the most serious problems evolution has, although they do try to minimize it because they don't like to say they have any problem. But, there's quite a few leading evolutionary scientists who admit this is a serious problem. And it is. And if you're not an evolutionary scientist, you can see it even easier. Okay, there's also the problem with the complexity of the cell. This is a serious problem for evolution. Because evolution can only happen once you have reproduction and mutation going on. If you don't have a living thing, there's no reproduction or mutation. So evolution cannot explain the beginning of life. Evolution, at its very best, can hope to explain how a living thing evolved into another living thing. But when you have only minerals and chemicals, they don't reproduce, they don't mutate, they don't preserve to another generation characteristics that they have. They're non-living. So abiogenesis is the whole subject of pre-biological evolution. Basically, so-called evolution before there was any living thing. But all real scientists will tell you what happened before the first living creature can't be called evolution. Evolution only works if you have a living thing. And by the way, Darwin, on the last page of his book, Origin of Species, published in 1859, actually wrote this. He said that it's possible that originally there were a few forms, or one, into which the Creator breathed life. Now, Darwin was not an atheist. In fact, the only formal study he had was in theology. He had gone to theological school, but he rejected it. And he became a self-taught naturalist and one of the most influential men in the realm of science and history. But he was not an atheist, or at least not at first. I don't know if he became one or not. Now, there's a rumor he became a Christian, but the rumor's not based on very good evidence. We don't have any reason to believe he did become a Christian, honestly, but I don't know that he became an atheist either. He certainly was not a Christian when he wrote. But he did say the first living thing may have had the Creator breathe life into it. Why would he say that? Because he can only talk about what happened to living things. You can't explain, he couldn't explain how non-living things could become living things. Now, how about modern science? How about Richard Dawkins? How many of you have seen that video put up by Ben Stein?
Oh.
Expelled, no intelligence allowed? That video, it's a movie you can get on, you can watch it on Netflix probably too. Yeah. It ends with an actual interview with Richard Dawkins. And Richard Dawkins, when he is asked, Ben Stein asks him, so where did the first living thing come from? And Richard Dawkins, who's probably as knowledgeable as any living biologist today, he said, we don't have the faintest idea. I mean, and he's unembarrassed about it. We just don't have any idea where it came from. But he said, but it had to come about through the same kind of natural processes that evolution later took. Now that's stating, that's his article of faith. He's a naturalist. He doesn't believe there's God. So wherever the first living thing came about, it couldn't come from God. It must come about naturally. And he even said in that interview, he says, you know, there's an intriguing possibility, and it just could be, that some highly intelligent creature from another planetary system came and seeded the Earth with the first living cell.
Oh dear.
Like a real quote.
And so Ben Stein said, so you don't really object to intelligent design, as long as it's not God. Which is a
So hilarious.
correct assessment of it. There are many evolutionists, now it's not a major view, but it is out there, called Panspermia, which is the idea that life from other planets actually brought life here first. Now, it's not a totally ridiculous view if you believe evolution took place on other planets and they somehow managed to get here and do that, but it's a desperate view. If you're going to have intelligence creating life, what's wrong with it being God's intelligence doing it? You know, why does it have to be another creature from another planet, which we have no more evidence for the existence of intelligent life on other planets than we have the existence of God. In fact, we have more evidence for the existence of God because he sent Jesus, who came down and rose from the dead and proved that he was the Son of God, and ascended in heaven again and did many other things to prove who he was, many infallible proofs. But anyway, so the evolutionary theory has a great number of problems. I was supposed to end a while ago, right?
Well, about 10 till, but.
Okay. I lost track of which hour this was. I'm sorry. So I spilled out into time you're supposed to have for something else. So tomorrow we'll be talking about Genesis. I knew I wasn't going to get to it today, but I didn't realize this was the hour. So I apologize for running over time. You should have just signaled me. Just throw something.
Maybe we can come
Mandatory
up
pass.
Maybe we can come up with a signal for like.
All right. First day you don't have the signal yet. Throw in the eraser.
Can we just give Steve a hand? 'Cause